Probably when I was a sophomore in high school, probably around the time I was 16.
And how do you know? How do you feel?
Well, it's hard not to know when you're a boy in an all-boys school.
You were attracted to the men.
That's probably an understatement.
So, what school you went to? And
I went to St. Francis in La Cañada.
Okay.
That's an interesting question. I think a lot of my friends and I, at first it seemed like a place to hide, and then the more honest I became with myself, I realized that's exactly what I was doing. But at the same time, I was developing as a person and realized that wasn't what I wanted to do. And the reason I left was because I wanted to go out and experience my life. And it corresponded with a time in the gay rights movement when that was an option for me. I knew a lot of older priests in the seminary and in my religious order who didn't have that option, and I think they remained priests and good priests. I'm not saying they were bad priests, but they remained in the seminary and they remained in the order because there weren't any other options for gay men.
Yeah.
I would say yes, I believe in God.
Okay.
I wouldn't say I'm religious, but I would say I believe in God. Not really. It's probably, the worst kept secret in the world that most of us in the seminary were or are gay. And I don't want to misconstrue that there was a lot of activity going on. It's just that there were an awful lot of us that, because if we entered very young, we entered for a lot of different conflicting reasons. And many of us who eventually found our way, to become friends, found that we were similar in terms of our outlook on life and in terms of our sexuality. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we acted upon it. It meant that we had a similar outlook on life. Some of us chose to remain in the church and in the order, and some of us chose to leave. I just happened to be one who chose to leave.
Okay.
For me, no. And actually, I think it's unfortunate that the church hasn't done a better job. The church doesn't despise homosexuality, but the church hasn't done a good job of explaining how it does feel about homosexuality. It certainly isn't pro-homosexual, but it doesn't despise homosexuality. And I think what I meant by running towards or hiding in the church was that until I had enough maturity to understand that I lived in a world where I could be myself, it was simply a place where I'm attracted to men. I could go and live in a place where I wouldn't be expected to marry or have to answer that question from so many relatives. Why haven't you met a nice woman and married? Or, when are you going to have children? And my mother saying, when are you going to give me a grandchild? Coming from a Catholic family, if you weren't going to give your parents and your grandparents a grandchild and a great-grandchild, the next best thing, or maybe an equal thing, would be to be ordained.
Yeah, makes sense.
So when I say hiding, it's hiding in plain sight. Well, I do recall hearing about AIDS around 1983 or 84, and it was so new that it was this great mystery. And then because I entered the seminary in 1984, I was more or less removed from it for a good 5 years. And then when I returned to the gay community, when I left the order, it was kind of like, trial by fire. I was just kind of thrown right back into the middle of it. As I said, my first boyfriend, when I returned to the gay community, we were obviously no longer together, but he had AIDS at that point, and many of the people in my social circle had AIDS, and it was startling, because it was not uncommon in those days to lose maybe 5 friends in any given month, or 10 friends in a half a year. And I was 23 at the time, and it was overwhelming to have to deal with that much death. You had to grow up very quickly. I remember a guy I dated at the time came up with the term Pablo. We couldn't relate to AIDS. We couldn't relate to something called AIDS. It was too clinical. But we could relate to Pablo. So we could talk about what an asshole Pablo was, and Pablo's such an asshole. He's fucked up our friend Jerry.
Yeah.
But we couldn't relate to AIDS because it was too clinical. It was something that happened to other people.
Interesting.
But Pablo, we were personifying the disease. We were relating to it in a way that we knew how.
Wow.
I would think that something that like this that you're doing is remarkable, because I find that there's a tremendous amount of ignorance about even the short history of the gay rights movement, and a lot of younger people, and I'm sounding like so many old men who say these kids today, but they don't understand the struggles of the height of the AIDS crisis, or they don't understand the struggles of the gay liberation movement in the 70s, and that was only 10 years before I came out. And seeing things like films like, the film Milk was wonderful, but seeing documentaries or biopics about Harvey Milk and other things like I can't think of her name right now, but that drag queen or transvestite in New York, and seeing these sort of signposts in the history of the LGBTQ movement. So many kids today think you get AIDS, you take a pill, you're gay, you go to the bar, and that they just take it for granted. And that's not the case, that because they didn't live through the epidemic, or through the height of the epidemic's still going on, or they didn't live through the struggles of the 70s, and certainly not through the 60s and the 50s, when people had to hide in seminaries. They just take a lot of things, again, I'm sounding like an old man, but they just take a lot of things for granted, and that's why I think something like this, and my advice would be to understand our history.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.